get back in it.
You do. Very comfortable. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for replying. It's a little bit like how it works at home with my kids. Good morning, no response, etc. So anyway, I'm Aaron Kramer. I head BSR. We're a nonprofit network of about 250 businesses focused on sustainability, working with the companies in our membership and a wide range of partners. And I'm delighted to be moderating a session with 4 terrific speakers this morning, and delighted to see all of the energy in the room. I think you're aware of what the topic is this morning. We're talking about how we can leverage private sector activity, working across different communities to create the kinds of sustainable economic value, social value that will work us towards the goal of prosperity shared amongst the 9 billion people who will be living on our planet by the middle of the century. So a big task, big goal, but very exciting. Ultimately, really, I think, the great challenge of the 21st century. Before we get into it, just an anecdote that illustrates how this plays out, and then I'll introduce our speakers. I was in London earlier this week at a meeting about clean cook stoves, a topic that a lot of people I think are aware of. And it was one of those times where when you went around and listened to people, you lost sight of the fact, or you couldn't tell who was coming from a big corporate, who was coming from government, who was coming from civil society. The perspectives were shared, they were diverse, and that's exactly the kind of thinking that we need. And if you think about that issue, the question can be posed, is this about the environment? Well, yes, because changing the way people cook reduces carbon in the atmosphere. Is this about human health? You bet it is, because this kind of carbon in homes is one of the biggest killers on our planet. And is it about economic development? Well, yes, it is, because people who don't have to go and collect fuel are much more able to engage in the formal economy. So I think that story illustrates exactly what we want to talk about this morning. Let me run ahead and introduce my colleagues up here. If you're live tweeting, by the way, please use the hashtag GPF14. I've already been seeing over the last couple of days that a lot of you are using that, and I hope you'll be fomenting conversation outside the room as we go ahead with the discussion inside the room. Starting at my far left, Patrick Dupuis is the CFO of PayPal, a company that many of you will know quite well and undoubtedly use. Patrick joined PayPal as he says, in his quest to understand the social and economic imperatives that shape the way that people in different cultures shop, save, and spend. It really is redefining the very modalities of commerce. Very, very exciting work in a very, very dynamic company. Bruce McNamara, to my immediate left, I've known for some years. Bruce is the head of global philanthropy and also is the CEO of the J.P. Morgan Chase Foundation. Bruce comes to this role with a broad range of experience in the public, private, and philanthropic sectors. He was, just prior to joining J.P. Morgan Chase, the president and CEO of TechnoServe and was also a White House fellow. So Mr. Trisector right here. Welcome, Bruce. Clara Miller is the president of the F.B. Heron Foundation in New York. Heron, many of you, again, may well know. It has been a real pioneer in looking at how a foundation can use its assets not only through grant making, but also through investments to achieve broader social purposes. Clara, prior to joining Heron, was the founding president and CEO of the nonprofit Finance Fund, a great organization that provides both financing and direct counsel to nonprofits. Finally, Fred Secret, Second, from the right, as you're looking up here, is Managing Director of the Abrage Group, a very dynamic private equity firm, and Fred spearheads the Abrage strategic and stakeholder engagement track of the firm, the platform from which Abrage works with a wide range of leaders from all different sectors. And at Abrage, he drives business development, but also stakeholder relations. So we'll be talking a lot about hybrid organizations. I think we've got some leaders here who are very well stuck into this notion of hybrid leadership and hybrid organizations. So we're going to talk about how private sector can drive different kinds of social and economic value. And I'd like to throw out a question here, and Patrick, maybe I'll start with you and we'll go from my left to right. Why is this idea getting so much traction right now? And how has PayPal changed and evolved in order to meet this moment that we're here to talk about?
All right, so first, thank you very much for having us here today. This is fascinating. I come from 30 years in business, 20 of it in GE, and I happen to be in a company now where, as we were preparing for this panel, I realized I was very blessed to be able to be a CFO every day, but my success indicators are fundamentally the same ones you would have. We measure ourselves in terms of network and health of our network and participation of people in the global economy. So I guess it feels like at no other time in human history have people been more empowered. We have a theme, and I have a theme that can relate to for my entire life, which is that good things happen when people are empowered and they are given access and they are connected. And at eBay and PayPal, we call it powering people and connected commerce. So I think we're talking about all of this because it's almost impossible today to ignore the power of individuals, and people understand, they know what's going on, and people are losing patience with siloed thinking and with being told that from 8 to 5 they are just a corporate person, and from 5 to 8 they are a family person, and in a voting booth they are a citizen.
What about between 9 and 12?
Yeah, just sleep a little bit. So that's it. I think it's a time where the full power of information and access is coming to fruition, real democracy at its best, and we're not equipped for this.
Well, I think you make a hugely important point. It is undeniable that people have more ability to influence outcomes for themselves than ever before, and that is, as many of these things are, a great opportunity, but also an interesting challenge for institutions that aren't used to having empowered individuals engaging in quite the same way. So I hope we'll get into this theme. Fred, why now, and how is Abrage meeting this moment?
So when I was thinking about how I'd answer your question, 3 words sort of came to my mind, or I'll choose to answer with 3 words. One is tensions, the second word is shifts, and the third is convergence. And I think we've been speaking over the last 2 days about many of these different shifts and tensions. But just to name a few of them, and there are many. The tensions of our world today, moving from a shareholder approach to a stakeholder approach. Moving from short-term thinking to long-term value creation thinking. Our systems are still very much focused in terms of thinking in days rather than decades. Whether it's your electoral systems, whether it's your rating systems, whether, all of our markets, and I think there's an inherent tension there, which is creating a lot of discomfort. And then there's this dual economy that we're living in, the want economy and the need economy. How many of us have kids who come to us and say, I want that new phone, when their phone is perfectly well and working? And we're all culprits of that too. And there's this want economy that is living right next door to this need economy, where people are underprivileged, are aspiring to better lives, are aspiring to a better future for their kids, and technology is making these two worlds live right next to each other. And that is creating a big source of tension. A few shifts. I think there's been a shift from the boardroom to the consumer. That's where the power is also very much moving to. There's a shift from developed countries to what many of you may call emerging markets. We call them global growth markets. We think these markets have emerged, and it's a bit patronizing calling them emerging markets. In fact, some countries in Europe are probably emerging markets rather than the ones that we're operating in.
It may be that we have dynamic markets and static markets,
Yes.
which flips things.
Or submerged markets.
Yeah. Yes.
There was mention yesterday of this shift about urbanization, which is clearly, there's the equivalent of 7 New York cities a year of people moving into cities in these markets. That's a huge phenomenon and a new shift. And so on and so on. The technology one, we've all moved from being listeners to broadcasters. Home used to be where you lay your hat. Where home is today is where the wireless connects automatically. Yeah. And that's just a completely different world that we're living in. So convergence, and then I'll just mention two. The youth in growth markets, in these markets, are not taking no for an answer anymore. And I think there is a convergence between youth globally that they can and will not accept the world that maybe some of us want to provide them as a legacy. And the second, I think, point of convergence is the agreement that there is a new middle class and a new consumption power that is emerging. And if we don't do anything about that, we're going to be living in a world which is going to be just impossible. Think that the Pacific Alliance countries in Latin America are the same size as Brazil today, but they're growing twice as fast. Africa today is at the same size that India was in 2005, but it has a higher GDP per capita. There's a whole slur of new consumers that are coming out. It's a great opportunity for many of our businesses, but it's also a huge challenge if we don't change the way we are operating our businesses. So I think that's why we are seeing the moment of now.
I'm feeling very energized to go out and address all of this great challenges. Great tour d'horizon. Clara.
Yeah, I love both of those answers. I can't wait to get home and do a needlepoint of home sweet instant internet.
Sweet Wi-Fi.
I'm going to hang over the living room sofa. So I'm going to answer that, and I agree with everything both Patrick and Fred have said. It's a very exciting time. From a philanthropy's point of view, a private foundation's point of view, we just can't possibly even pretend that if we stay in our own small terrarium, we can even pretend that we're addressing the kind of urgent and systemic problems that are out there. That the notion that philanthropy can somehow address problems on the margin and succeed in actually leveraging anything without partnering with government, with the private sector, without putting itself into the context of the whole economy is foolhardy. I think we're kidding ourselves, and we're consigning ourselves to a kind of a boutique operation of wishful thinking. So when Heron kind of took stock of, and the Heron Foundation's mission is to help people and communities help themselves out of poverty. And we took stock, when I arrived as president 3 years ago, and I said to myself, I've been on the other side of the grantor-grantee equation too long to utter those 13 words that the field fears most, which are, we have a new president and we're going to do strategic planning. So instead we kind of did strategic tapas, and we said, you know what, we're looking at the front pages of the New York Times, and if our mission is to help people and communities help themselves out of poverty, we haven't been doing so well. And Heron has a long and proud tradition of doing impact investing, of investing its assets for mission, and of funding some really grassroots, terrific organizations. I arrived with this terrific legacy, and we all had to agree, board and staff together, that poverty was worse than it had been ever in the US history, and we focus on the US. So just having said that, we then said we need to be engaging with the whole economy, that having access on the margin to an economy that's not creating reliable work for the people we care about, we're saying, look, buy homes with debt, but not have reliable jobs. This does not lead to a good place. So in order to take that systemic look, we said, okay, all of our assets are investment for mission. We don't have a division between the investment side and the giving side. It's all capital being put into the market in support of our mission. And the reason we did that was that we can't in any way pretend that we don't exist within the real economy and as part of it and connected to it.
Great, thank you. You got some great nervous laughter from the audience with that strategic
I like that.
comment. Yeah. Bruce, you have worked in all sorts of different sectors. So what's your high-level view of this and the implications for all of us in the room?
Well, and it's a little hard. I just would build on what my colleagues have said and note just a couple other things. One, the involvement of private sector in addressing social problems. Some of that is driven by a whole new set of opportunities for private sector companies to be involved in addressing social problems, whether that's in green technologies or provision of financial services, or participating in new markets where there have heretofore not been many opportunities to actually go in and grow your business. So part of that is just the imperatives of the market as they've all existed kind of expanded a little bit more than they've used to. I think that's true too. You can think of those opportunities for, as we classically, big multinational companies, but on the ground in very poor places there are more and more opportunities, private sector opportunities for people that weren't there before. You think about what's happened in China in the last decade, where 400 people emerging from poverty, many by a much more active participation in the private
400
sector.
million.
400 million people, yeah. What did I say?
400.
400. Those are bigger, yeah. And indeed, there are actually business imperatives that are driving people to actually look at whole new sets of markets, both in terms of products and services in different parts of the world. I'd also say there's a greater receptivity and, in fact, requirement for multi-stakeholder collaboration in addressing big problems. And multi-stakeholder, it's no longer enough to have government at the table in addressing certain problems, or civil society. It's now increasingly important that it be civil society, government, and business sort of gathering around these problems, like global warming, like food insecurity, like a burgeoning youth population. These are global. They require participation of many partners, and business increasingly is seen as a necessary, I think, partner in those kind of undertakings. And I think with that, there's a whole lot of less mistrust. I think, Darren Walker was talking yesterday about the sort of oppositional constructs we have in thinking about not just addressing social problems, but generally historically, civil society on the one side, business on the other. And more, I think there's a welcoming of what business can bring to the table in terms of addressing problems, in terms of not just resources, but able to think about, efficiency in the allocation of capital, the delivery of services, and the realization that many times, if the market opportunity is there, business can be that pathway from a program or a pilot to actually uptake and sustainability of a lot of the solutions that we're trying to engender by coming together. So I think there's a confluence of things coming together around, private sector has opportunities, private sector brings something to the dialogue, private sector is in fact a necessary part of addressing social problems that all come together.
So great overview. Let me dive in and ask and throw it open to any of you who want to respond. I think there are a couple of dilemmas that came out in what you're talking about, because Patrick, you're absolutely right. More people have more ability to influence their own outcomes than ever before. And yet, we have a growing problem about income inequality, not only in the United States, but in many parts of the world, including some of the most dynamic growth markets in the world. So that's one piece. The other is something, Claire, that you mentioned, that it's absolutely crucial to create systemic solutions, and yet we're living in a world where power and information is rapidly decentralizing. So how do we pull systems change together at a time when actually you can see a little bit, you can see some islands developing because different groups and individuals have the ability to shape outcomes. So how do you deal with those dilemmas? Or by moving on to the next question.
No, I'll just start, but from a different perspective, because this is maybe the toughest question, actually, in my mind, because I'm listening to what you guys discussed the last few days and to what we're dealing with here. Human nature is pretty selfish, but we're very social by nature. So we all want to be together, we all want to help each other, but in the end, we all measure our success very individually. And I'm sure that when I'm a pure corporate product, every one of you in this room, however philanthropic you are, you're still very driven by your personal success. And so that's who we are. And so there is a need to accept that, and there's a need for some kind of incentives or reward system or education that gets people to feel as good about winning together as winning individually. And I was lucky enough to grow up in a company, GE, that has a reputation of being very corporate, but I've never, since then, been around as much collaboration as I did there, because the main reward was the outcome. We were rewarded for getting to the right outcome, not for getting there alone. Best practice, and so there is something to be said. It's not an answer, but I wrestle with this every day as a leader, as a coach. We have a big charity at PayPal, which channels $7 billion of charity payment a year, and we've had to isolate that unit from the rest of PayPal just to make sure the investment gets protected. So there are ways around, and every one of us every day has an opportunity to be a little bit more committed to redefine success. So I'll leave this on the table, and then you guys answer, because I don't know how to answer it. But there is something around how we recognize success. We still recognize success too individually. And if you want to empower people, you need to have that connection so that they feel that they will win better, and it will be more rewarding to win for the right impact, not just for the selfish recognition.
Smart incentives drive good outcomes. Yeah. Anybody else want to dive in? Bruce?
Well, just to build on precisely that, and again, this is all in the realm of slightly theoretical, but wouldn't we love to get there? And it is, how do we harness the energy, the productive capacity, the ability to just increase societal wealth that business can bring to the table, and augment that to kind of bridge that gap that can arise between the haves and the have-nots. And that oftentimes, I think, can be the role for government and for philanthropy. I know even at JP Morgan we think about that. It's, the bank is in the business of economic growth. We happen to believe that broader-based economic growth is a good thing, and part of what we use philanthropy for is to make sure we're building bridges so that we do enable that broad-based growth. I think this other question, though, of, in an age of, we're all broadcasters, I think, Fred, to your point, I know I missed the early part of the conversation here around Egypt particularly, but I did hear Secretary Clinton earlier this week talk about her own experience of that. And that to me is touches on some of the dangers in that in an age where we can tweet the revolution, what happens to institutions? And are we kind of disintermediating a whole host of the institutions that sometimes do the work and the heavy lifting, and whether those are political institutions or civil society institutions, there is risk in that, because who at the end of the day does the work? And I think we're at a kind of a period, we'll get to a new equilibrium, but we're not there yet, and there is this kind of coming apart, and maybe that's just how systems work and that's how the world evolves. But it's certainly a little worrisome to be in the middle of that.
Dana Boyd, who's a researcher for Microsoft's written a book called It's Complicated, based on her study of teenagers and social media, and what she's found is that teenagers are more socially committed than past generations and far less likely to channel that through established institutions. So that, I think, is a really interesting outcome that speaks to this evolution. Clara, you wanted to...
Well, that is interesting. We have it's a slightly different take, I guess, in that, I have this slight war cry at the office, which is accounting is destiny. And so some of what we do, I know. Somebody said it to me once, if accounting is destiny, I'm going to kill myself. I'm going to jump off a bridge. And I said, well, you'll be the first martyr to accounting then. This is really great.
The green eye shade revolution is here.
Exactly. So, what we mean by that is that we're looking at our portfolio, we're looking at all our exposures, whether it's to a public company or to a nonprofit, as part of a continuum of social and financial return or social and financial performance. And we think you can monitor positive and negative for both in real time as part of what an impact investor looks at. So that you're not pretending that there's this part of the economy that's the bad part, and then there's this tiny little part that's weak and is the cleanup crew, that in fact, all of the things we care so deeply about become part of the core business. And I think both of you have made that point numerous times. Part of the core business of either a public company or a nonprofit or an institution or a government, just as readily. And that we are holding ourselves to account with a lot of the new data tools we have in that kind of a situation, rather than pretending there's this sort of bifurcation where, these guys get to do whatever the hell they want, and these small, weak nonprofit organizations are on an ever, kind of increasing number of problems. So that's my that's Heron's hope, is that's the way impact investment works. That's the way we look at the opportunity before us. And
Fred, maybe you can dive in and tell us a little bit about how this works at practice at Abraj, and how you've made investments to achieve these kinds of outcomes.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, because it started with a very philosophical answer here and moving to the practice. But I totally agree with what you said. But to be maybe somewhat provocative and with full respect to Bruce, I think, and some of you here in the hall, I would submit that if we succeed in embedding into our businesses this approach of financial and social returns being balanced out, that Bruce should be out of a job in 5 to 10 years, because corporates should no longer need to have foundations. It should be embedded into their businesses in terms of what they're doing. And so
Bruce will be circulating his CV after the session.
You can come work for us.
Better enough.
So, I'm sorry, Bruce. But that's why we didn't create a foundation. What we've developed we are a for-profit investor. Our investors give us funds and they expect to get a best-in-class return. We're commercially driven. But when we invest with a very strong environmental and social lens, and we look at it as a value-creating mechanism rather than a cost or boxes that need to be ticked. But in order to get that value system really embedded in the business, we have created internally a program called the 5+5+5. So it's 5% of our top line, not our bottom line, but our top line. 5% of annual bonuses of our employees on a voluntary basis, and 5 mandatory days of time per year that's paid for by the company that needs to be allocated into the various projects that we invest in the communities in which we're operating. Basically focused on the theme of entrepreneurship, because that's where our skill set lies, and the markets in which we're operating are all characteristic of high unemployment and youth bulge. So we feel the best way we can have an impact over and above the core of our business is to stimulate SME growth, is to stimulate employment by applying every day our people to think in terms of their own business models and skills, what they can do in the markets in which they're operating. So that's, we're not, Danone does something else. They're a nutritionist, and they should be focusing on where their skill set lies. We are passionate about building enterprises and businesses, and that's what we think we should be giving back to the communities in terms of helping them grow and giving people a chance.
What are some of the challenges? I think this vision absolutely makes sense. If there's anyone in the room who disagrees with it, but it's not that simple. So how do you make sure, and maybe Bruce, if I can start with you, you work in a very large institution, which, as you say, has a wide range of objectives, and people talk about too big to fail. How about too big to integrate? I mean, is it, how do you take these ideas across such a massive institution?
Yeah, well, I think you start by, you've been witness to the evolution of maybe strategic philanthropy, and this notion that, at least from a corporate, as long as we're still doing corporate philanthropy, that what we do ought to be consistent with what we do as a business. So to make what we're doing philanthropically relevant to our lines of business. So at JP Morgan, we're focused on economic development, around financial capacity, around affordable housing, around small business development, and around workforce development. And those really do link up to various of our lines of business. They're not relevant for all of our lines of business, and they're certainly not relevant for all of our employees. But just to begin with the choice that says, this is what we do as a bank, therefore this is what we're going to do as a philanthropy, not just because we'll give away $250 million this year, but because you can actually do more than that, because you can bring parts of the bank, where appropriate, where to bear on looking at these particular social issues, not just the financial piece of that, but the skills, the networking, the ability to convene a global set of client relationships, the ability to allocate that capital efficiently, you name it, skilled volunteerism or real line of business interests. And again, that integration may not actually be like this. It may be this particular line of business focused on small business, that part of what we do philanthropically. This particular part of our business and investment banking focused on what we're trying to do with global cities. I mean, it may not be that kind of seamless across the bank, but that's okay. We're doing what we can to leverage the bank where it works for what we're trying to do philanthropically.
Claire, jumping to you, how do you transcend some barriers that, as you said earlier, exist in the foundation world to this kind of thinking beyond the borders, the somewhat arbitrary borders that we're recognizing?
Right. It's something of a challenge. These are institutions of long standing with a very strong culture that has systematically separated the investment function from the philanthropic function. And so, culture change is the hardest of all, of course. It's, it seems like a good idea at the time, but the devil's in the details. But there's a lot of interest in this. I think there's a tremendous amount, there's a tremendous depth of realization among the people in the philanthropic world that the resources we have are not consummate with the problems we're facing. I'm not the only one who's voicing this anxiety. So I think philanthropy is really looking for ways it can think of itself and reinvent itself to be more effective. I do think that there is something of a movement on to, in a sense, redefine the meaning of fiduciary responsibility in the 21st century, that it's about all the assets of the foundation for mission. There's a duty of obedience to mission. There's a duty of care that transcends just care of the institution, that's actually care to the beneficiaries and the reputation of the organization. So I think these are the sorts of themes that philanthropy is starting to surface and examine. And you know, I do think that there will always be, there's a kind of a, how do you, I mean, part of what you carry around in the nonprofit sector is that you have an ambivalent business proposition. You want, in a way, to put yourself out of business, of course. You really want a world where Chase is doing such a fantastic job of financing jobs and economic development everywhere, and there's no poverty. Same with Heron Foundation. So we don't need to have a silly Heron Foundation or a silly, you know, Chase Foundation.
Claire will also be circulating her
Right?
CV later.
Anyway, but you get what I mean. I mean, it's sort of like you really want to stamp out poverty. You don't want to, you know, continue build the capital market for nonprofit, you know, finance really at all. You want to make it so it's not necessary.
Well, and the fiduciary responsibility point is hugely important. Publicly traded companies, it's why there's an effort to drive now integrated reporting, which in my view is likely to emerge over the next 10 years or so. And you've got over 100 global companies piloting this approach
Absolutely.
now, saying that our financial models are broken and we need to measure success very, very differently.
Well, and they want to get the stockholders they deserve, right? People who are demanding something beyond quarterly earnings reports or whatever it is. Yeah.
Patrick, you've worked in two very different institutions. GE, a classic old industrial economy company, and PayPal, a classic new economy company. But there must be silos, there must be barriers, even inside a very dynamic company that's reshaping the very concept of commerce.
Yeah, and actually, I think John Donahoe and Jack Welch, in their own ways, did something relatively similar. I joined GE in '84. Jack had been the CEO for only 3 years, and it took him 10 years to turn a mastodon bureaucracy into a fast-growing industrial company again. And then he had his own blind sides, and then Jeff Immelt is undoing a lot of what he did. And John Donahoe comes around, and this eBay thing was just a darling, and he started to remove fraud and put some moral boundaries around what was acceptable on eBay, and he was vilified for 2 or 3 years. There was Neutron Jack, and then there was the devil John Donahoe. And so, as I was thinking through what you were all saying, is I can't remember a time in my 30 years, and I spent a lot of time in Asia, and I'm observing what's happening in China now. The top leader has to be carrying the flag. We can talk about all of our companies' cultures, all of our organizations' cultures are fundamentally pretty healthy. I'm a French guy. I've left my country. I complain about my country all the time. And then I go back to my alma mater, and I look at those kids, and I'm humbled. They are as hungry as I was, and they are a lot more socially aware than I was. But in the end, the leader of the institution has to decide this is a priority. It's too hard.
Totally.
It's too hard.
Totally.
It starts at the top. So in this case, John has made it very clear that we don't exist for our shareholders. We just reward our shareholders. We exist for the communities we support, our communities of employees, of consumers, and of sellers. We have stories after stories of people who are able to survive today because they are able to create a business and have access to the world, and they create jobs. The GE story is an interesting one because GE, like all of the old industrial companies, has been a huge polluter for this country. And they were wrestling for decades with their obligations to their shareholders, and then the reality that they had massive polluted sites around. What I found interesting is particularly the Hudson River. at some point in the transition between Jack and Jeff Immelt, they just decided to go from resisting any remediation to leaning in all the way, right? And it's the culture that Jack created within GE of empowering the employees and being transparent that ended up forcing the company to lean in. So what was good for the company, which is to create a more agile culture, also took a life of its own, and it became unacceptable for the employee base of GE to be in a company that would not remediate. How powerful is that? It's all intertwined, so it starts at the top. And then what you demand from your own executives and what you reward, it takes time. And so for all of you, and I do think we're going to need dedicated foundations for quite a while, but I would redefine it to say that you're all teachers, and you can either tell or you can teach and help re-architect. And where I admire what you do and what you describe you do is if a leader is exposed to possible path, which I think is your job for JP Morgan, they will follow those paths. Just lay the tracks for them. They need to find a way. How could they think about what they do every day, turn it into a definition of social impact, but not necessarily have to brandish big flags, but just say, I'm going to start adding this measurement. We had a fascinating board meeting yesterday, and the leader of marketing for eBay in North America simply added one metric to a scorecard. That's all. Donation through eBay. 1 over 5 metrics. 30% in 1 year. Everybody followed. The boss is making it up there. Everybody follows. So we need to engage all those leaders, and everybody will go at their pace. But if you start to articulate what their company does that could be good for the world and that they can rally their employees behind, they will start measuring it, and then incredible things happen.
The remarkable thing is that in a bottom-up world, the nature of leadership has to change even that much more quickly, because there's no more monopoly on information, there's no more reliance on true hierarchy, so the nature of our leaders in all institutions absolutely has to evolve. Fred, let me ask you one question, and then I'm going to give all of you a chance to ask questions. We'll have mics around the room. We're sitting here in California having this conversation. As you alluded to earlier, the most dynamic growth is taking place outside the US, outside Europe, outside Japan. What gets missed in conversations like this, in places like this, that you see, investing in Pakistan, investing in Turkey, investing in places that aren't as well represented in these discussions very often? We'll hear from the Foreign Minister of Egypt in a little while, but what should this audience know and understand that sometimes gets overlooked in these discussions?
I would first say, don't believe everything you read in the press or you hear on CNN.
It's all about the Malaysian airliner anyway.
What? There is an extraordinary momentum in young entrepreneurs across Africa, across the Middle East, across Southeast Asia. I mean, you mentioned the Arab world, and the Egyptian foreign minister is going to be here in a little bit. We have investments in Egypt, big investments. These entrepreneurs are committed to their businesses, to their employees, to their communities. We are seeing 20% revenue growth year on year throughout our whole portfolio in these markets across all of North Africa. Tunisia, same thing. Morocco, same thing. Egypt, absolutely. So I think what I'm trying to say on the first part is that these macro volatility, political volatility, things that we hear about all the time are not reflective of the truth, of the underlying truth. It's not because a country is going through positive GDP growth that you automatically derive profitable returns for your businesses. It's the micro that counts. And it's really understanding the themes, the sectors, and the communities in which you're operating, your marketplace. So I think I would say that, first of all, you can't lump all of the Middle East or all of Africa in the same basket. So that's very important in terms of investment. In terms of philanthropy, there is an incredible amount of young people, and we see them, who are no longer wanting to work for just a paycheck, but who are wanting to work for companies that make a difference. And they are having an impact on us. I mean, I used to say I have one of the best jobs in the world because I get to go around the planet saying, yes, investment bankers do have a soul. And sometimes they don't know it. That's just the problem. But this young generation that is coming up on board is changing the way we are operating inside our firm. And we have to embrace that. It's about embracing it. But in these markets, Aaron, I really encourage those of you who have not been out there to just go, because you will be mesmerized by the amount of talent and it's not about, yesterday the president of the World Bank, mentioned we all need to be aspiring to help the poor. I think it goes further than that. It's really about our self-enlightened interest. It goes further than just helping the poor. We don't like this term of poverty or charity. It's sort of, it's built on the premise that it's a partnership of unequals. Mm-hmm. You're poor and I'm not. Mm-hmm. It's about looking and working to our self-enlightened interest. So as an investor, as a philanthropist, looking at creating those partnerships where everybody walks out with a win-win, rewarding your shareholders, but also having a positive impact on the communities is what we see out there. So please go.
Excellent. And we're going to go to all of you. I know we've got some mics. As always, the lights are shining, so I can vaguely see hands, but not faces. Got a gentleman right here and then a woman right there, and a number of them. Please, if you will, introduce yourself, and please be brief, and we like questions a lot better than speeches.
Thank you. My name is Marcus. I'm with the United Nations Development Program. Fascinating discussion, I think, towards the right way in terms of the core business, moving beyond CSR. There's an unprecedented interest from the business community on the process of developing the next goals that are going to replace the Millennium Development Goal, right? We at the United Nations are very involved in that process, and I see from Paul Pullman and the Secretary General high-level panel and so much of the business community around the United Nations trying to influence this process. My question is, what should governance of the world ask back of the private sector as a formal commitment to the next development goals? Not voluntary codes and things like that, but if they want to sit on the table, what are they going to give back?
Great question. We haven't talked a lot about government this morning. What anyone want to dive in on that? The Sustainable Development Goals are being negotiated as a successor to the Millennium Development Goals. What should business ask of governments?
No.
Oh, sorry, what should governments ask of business?
Businesses.
You want to take that on?
Sure. What should they ask of business, as if business were this monolithic thing? My observation, maybe in my old job, more in this, is that those businesses most engaged in those conversations are among the most enlightened businesses. Yeah. Those are the businesses you want in those conversations, and those businesses typically have a much more nuanced view as to the role that business plays in development and what business can bring to the table. So I see it less of an insistence by business writ large that we're at the table and we assert this set of demands, rather than a kind of self-selected group who are already pretty much out ahead. And I see that, I used to see that in different contexts, not so much the UN, but in a World Economic or other forum contexts where, you know, your interlocutors there, the CEOs who are showing up, are the people you want showing up. And I think less an insistence that you give me this, I'll give you that, rather than this collaborative, let's figure out who does what and who can commit to what and who the incentives are right for which of these parties in these what are ultimately public-private collaborations is a really important way to think about that.
Fred, I know Abrage's founder, Arif Naqvi, is very involved in the UN Global Compact, for example.
Sure, I mean, and I agree, Bruce, you know, business, big monolithic sort of approach, that question needs to be parceled out. But from the private equity industry, indeed our founder sits on the UN Global Compact board. And what we're doing is on the 15th of May in Oslo, we've convened a small roundtable with private equity players with a view of discussing what can we do as an industry, seeing that the Millennium Development Goal targets are coming up in 2015 and we're really falling short. So, you know, here is a Middle Eastern private equity firm, or a private equity firm born in the Middle East, we're global now, but coming to Oslo and asking the foreign minister of Oslo to host a roundtable where we'll have Mark Moody Stewart and a few others from the Global Compact with a view, and other private equity players, with a view of saying, what can we do as an industry? With all respect, without the governments, but what can we do as an industry in order to play our part in achieving the MDGs and taking them further? So I think it's all these kinds of initiatives that the private sector can help and undertake in a collaborative way.
I can't resist answering your question from a slightly different angle. I'm sorry, but the incentives that governments set need to change so that public markets in particular work better, because right now the incentives are out of sync with the objectives of the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainability Development Goals that will come. So government reform will unleash the power of the private sector, but that reform is far too slow in coming. Anyway, I think we had one right there. Yes.
As I listen to your conversation today, my name is Erna Gross, and I'm the CEO of Asante Africa Foundation. President Clinton had a quote that we rally around quite a bit. Brilliance and talent are universally distributed. Opportunity is not. Yep. And as I hear each of you talk, it gives great hope around closing that gap because of the awareness of knowledge and opportunity. So we talked at a very high level. What I would love for one of you to share is a real live, on the ground, concrete story that just makes you feel good. I'd love for one of you to share that.
I need to pick this one up.
Go.
And me.
This is...
philanthropy, we don't have those feel-good stories.
Being a CFO of a public company is such a bear. To be in a company like PayPal, I have the pleasure of seeing everyday stories about that fill my coffers, and yet we're all grounded in. So I have 3 stories, but I'll just do one so that others can share. And because I've spent so much time in Asia, India being the main country I spend most of my time, we have PayPal is allowing, with eBay, people who have a gift to be able to express that gift globally. And this one lady was doing little bracelets and found eBay and started to post them on eBay and started to really get orders from all over the world. And today she has this company with her mom, and they have 9 employees. Now, we've made money along the way, don't get me wrong. But we've also allowed people in other parts of the world to buy bracelets of very high quality that they could not afford in their country. So there is something very powerful in where giving access, because a local bank would not have funded her, and the credit cards would not have given her a credit card, and It's just, and we have stories after stories. We have 4,000 agents on the phone. We are the anti-Silicon Valley company. We have a lot of people taking care of you other than through the computer. And that's what keeps them going every day. They talk to people every day who have a real story like this. And so that's my story.
Excellent. I think everyone wants to answer this question,
Okay,
right?
so I'll take you for 2 minutes to Karachi in Pakistan, 5th largest city in the world. The Karachi Electric Supply Company is the last sort of monopoly, I think, utility in the world of transmission, generation, and distribution of electricity. And it was, in 2006, really the best broken company you could ever have imagined. You could have gotten McKinsey there and said, break this company into bits. They wouldn't have done a better job than what it was. Theft, corruption, load shedding, electricity just not getting to the small mom and pop shops, and so on and so forth. Anyways, very difficult investment for us to undertake. Do we go ahead and do it or not? We did. We started by transforming the company on the inside. We created a program for stakeholders that are the employees. Never forget your employees, right? Giving them pride again in order to be working for this company. We started naming and shaming some of the richest parts of Karachi who were not paying their electricity bills. Our guys out there that we embedded in the company started getting death threats. Their cars were being bombed in the parking lot in front of the company. We then started undertaking efforts as we invested in improved transmission and generation of electricity. We then undertook efforts to take the company into the city. We created a football league for the kids in the slums so that they would be taken out of the slums, but only play football if you go through an English class in the afternoon before. We then took the 18 hospitals that service about 80% of Karachi and guaranteed to them uninterrupted electricity for free, in order to allow medicines also to remain cold. We undertook 20,000 classroom educational programs on energy conservation. So we started bringing the whole city into making what was the most hated company in the country, a company that was much closer to its citizens. So we've been undertaking all these transformations, and the last project that we've been working on is outside of Karachi. There's the largest cattle colony in the world. It's called Landi. There's 400,000 cows there, small-scale farmers. It's an ecological disaster. It's where the milk comes to be collected for the city of Karachi. And if you look at Google Earth picture and you look at Landi, you will see the brownness that is going into the sea, because when it rains, the dung just goes into the sea, and the fisheries have been completely destroyed. So what we're doing with Canadian technology and the IFC is we are looking, and we've started building the world's largest biogas project, a 22 megawatt power station outside, reorganizing all of the way this whole colony and cattle colony is working, and working with the farmers and working with the fisheries in order to see how we can resuscitate that whole area. I'll finish by saying two things. Our ultimate vision is to use the electricity that this biogas project would generate in order to rehaul the rickshaws of Karachi from moving them from petrol to electricity. That's our ultimate vision. It has nothing to do with our bottom line. It has everything to do with giving back to the community. The second thing I'll say is that 2 years ago, the company ran, for the first time in 18 years, a profitable year. So it just proves the case, and we also have, we have 160 stories like this, that by looking at your social returns and your financial returns, you can achieve success and reward your shareholders.
Excellent. Clara.
Fantastic. I adore that story, and could listen all day. So I'm just going to tell a kind of a feel-good and feel-worried story, because I think that most stories are sort of like that. The feel-good part is that Heron's only one of a huge number of investors and customers of this organization called PHI, or Paraprofessional Healthcare Institute, which is in the South Bronx. It's the top company and has 2 affiliates, one of which is the largest cooperative of home health aides in the United States. I think it's 2,500 people, mostly women. mostly African American and Latinos, who get a living wage, training, and are in a for-profit cooperative. And on the other side, a managed care organization, about $250 million large-scale organization. So we and a group of others are trying to put what we call philanthropic equity. It's equity where we will leave the return in the nonprofit and help it grow to another stage, because it's undergoing exactly the same kind of growth as a for-profit does, but you can't have ownership stakes in a nonprofit and so on. So this organization, the top company we're trying to help grow, had a huge triumph, which was it managed to get its workers, the home health workers in New York State, covered under the minimum wage laws. They weren't before. And this has a massive positive effect on their lives, far beyond what philanthropy could do alone, or government alone, or anybody else alone. So we were thrilled by this, and we thought, wow, there's growth out there in the home health business because of demographics, because of healthcare reform, because of a lot of other things in the United States. So we said, let's go out and look, and this is the worried story. Let's go out and look in the for-profit sector for some exposures, private equity, just plain debt funds, whatever it was, and see what the home health care industry looks like. Well, I can tell you, don't look very pretty in the way it treats its workers. It's contingent workforce, it's well below minimum wage, no health benefits, on and on and on. Taking people who we want to care for us, in the most vulnerable people, and not treating them well. So getting back to what do we want, what do we want government to do? What do we want private sector to do? We want the private sector to be saying to itself, we need to do better, just as I think gentlemen on my left are saying, that all of us are saying. It can't just be because somebody's forcing you or regulating you to do it. It has to come from this kind of ethical reality. Because I can tell you, the worried story is, it's a special, wonderful, shining exception to a really scary-looking world in home health care.
Bruce, you're fairly new in your job, but
Yeah.
What story would you like to tell? And then, by the way, I'm going to come back for one, maybe two questions really fast, because we're going to run out of time.
And I'll be quick. The best part of my job at TechnoServe, and the best part of my job, and I think it's probably true for all of us, is being out in the field and seeing what it is that we actually do. And in my career at TechnoServe, I can literally point to literally thousands of those stories of entrepreneurs or small business owners or that farm co-op, or at the level of a sector in a particular country where just through dint of people's aspirations and investments, they were making a difference in their own lives. And even in my early tenure at JP Morgan Chase, being among sort of high school graduates in Chicago, in very poor parts of that city, but by virtue of having investments made in them, in their ability to build actually technical skills that were relevant for that particular job market, the excitement and enthusiasm and the kind of pathway that was ahead for them by kind of combining what we could bring to the table with their own aspirations. But the thing I'd kind of come back around to, I got a photograph from my colleagues at TechnoServe as I was leaving the organization. And for me, it kind of sums what all this stuff is about. I never met this man in this photograph. He's an Ethiopian farmer. I happen to know that he was as head of a co-op there, a coffee co-op, that over the previous 5 years had transformed their community by their ability to link into kind of the global market for high quality coffee and the transformative effect of that. But that photograph, you'd see it, and you see probably a 50-year-old man who's sort of the anti-poverty charity picture. It is frightening. The fierceness in this man's eyes, the intellect that's sort of shining out at you is mesmerizing. And it is not, their fly is buzzing at the corner of the child's, and will you take care of this? This is a guy that if he doesn't scare the hell out of you, you would follow him anywhere. And to be able to invest in people like that in very poor places where they haven't had opportunities is what gets us up in, I think, all of this, because that's appealing to, it's not the poverty, it's the opportunity. It's the ability, I'm going to help you help yourself. And those kinds of stories, back to your original quote, those folks are everywhere, and it's our job to kind of find them, identify them, and give them that opportunity, those tools, what it takes to leverage that kind of aspiration.
Catalytic question with some fabulous answers. Quick here, and then I want to give this side of the room, this gentleman right here, be really brief, and then I'm going to ask everyone to pick whatever you want from these two questions you're about to get for the last word.
Okay, my name is Asha Jadeja from the Motwani family. I just wanted to share with you something important that I'm noticing here. I'm one of the first. I find myself as one of the few people from the Silicon Valley who is here in this conference. I wish there were more of us, because there is lots that can be leveraged from the Valley. I'm also early Google. I'm a venture capitalist here, second investor in PayPal. And I just want to know that, if this kind of a forum can engage, not the wealth of the Valley so much, not the financial wealth, because that's there in the corporate sector and other places. But if there could be a better way to leverage the innovation and the sort of the entrepreneurial ideas of these entrepreneurs. I don't see anybody here from, who are the true entrepreneurs that started some of these big companies. I don't see them here, and I wish there were more.
Okay, thank you. And right here, can we get the microphone right over here? Right here, this gentleman at the front table.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for an interesting discussion. A lot of what we become and what we do, we learn in school, and how we are educated both at school and at home. My question is, if you had the opportunity, what would you change in the education system that would teach us to measure things differently in society, in business, and also personal success?
Thank you. How do we change education, and how do we get the Valley more involved? Patrick, I'll start with you.
I'm not a big fan of the Valley.
A Google bus is going to chase you on the way back to PayPal.
And my friends at PayPal and eBay and my colleagues knew I was going to say that. It's a very selfish culture. And I don't know if you're aware of this new show on TV called The Silicon Valley, but I heard the director on NPR the other day, and he had been a coder in a company here, and he said, those people, they're funny. They always say they're changing the world. Even when they pitch to a VC, either their old pitch is about changing the world, or they remember on their way out and say, oh, and of course, we're making the world better. I think the answer is what we've been saying all day, is that Silicon Valley is the epitome of what's the best in humankind and the worst in humankind. And so we need to take those leaders one by one, and we need to sit down with them and remember that they have a soul, and they're very busy, and they're making the world better. And they just need somebody to help them lay a few tracks at a time. And they don't like to be lectured. There's one thing I always say at PayPal, I've learned the hard way, is that I can't tell them what to do better, I just need to show them. If I tell them, they will have 10 arguments. If I show them, because they don't know what they don't know, they're not global, they see good. So they need to be shown.
Great. Fred?
It's such a big question. I speak like an American, but actually I am French, like Patrick. So I think we could start by changing the education system in France, don't you think?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But it's about values. Yes, it does start in the family. I mean, if I think of our business, we look at values at 3 levels. And maybe that's the way, a framework to think about in terms of education systems. But we have 3 levels of values. We have our core values on the pyramid, on which we're, the stakeholder approach and ethics and all the good things that a company wants to abide by. The second level is about value preservation. and how you put in place the right risk mitigation systems and the right management practices. And the third level is value enhancement, and that's looking at community work and environmental and social lenses and governance through your investments. That's the way we look at value and values. On the education-wise, we go, let me take an example. In the Arab world, 8% of the youth want to actually go and start their own businesses, only. They all want to go to government to look for their job. So one of the programs that we've been working on with Junior Achievement, which is well known in the States, is taking Junior Achievement to expand its work in the Middle East. So we go into classrooms and help and talk to kids about what it is to run a business, to have an idea. And you see the eyes on the lights of these kids just illuminated. So I think more role models, more engagement in the classroom, and more focus on women. Because in those classrooms, it's the women that are just,
Perfect segue.
Yeah,
Clara.
well,
Yeah.
I wish I were French.
Well, I was
No, you don't. I don't think so. No, you don't. I don't think so.
I was sitting here thinking, I'm an American who's sending his kids to French school in California. What's wrong? Clara.
Well, I've got to say, on the same vein, I think that we have a kind of a drift toward the overly focused on skills and, teaching specific information as opposed to thinking, problem solving, and all of my favorites, which include things like Junior Achievement, arts programs, music, drama, sports, where people are learning, kids are learning to work together with a lot of different kinds of children and people of varying abilities in a team setting. I can't emphasize enough how the idea of integrating class, race, and a bunch of other things in real activities like drama and music and so on is just being lost, and sports, is being lost to a kind of a grind-like teach to the test thing. And I can tell you, I had a pretty superly advantaged early learning childhood experience. I would have been lost to deep juvenile delinquency without the arts and sport.
It's never too late.
It's almost. As long as it can be in France, it's okay.
Bruce?
Well, just a couple things. One, on the Silicon Valley, I think Silicon Valley does have so much to offer in very poor places by virtue of its approach to innovation and to technology. It has to be harnessed and coupled, though, with humility and with the notion that just because you can figure it out here doesn't mean you can figure it out there. And I think you can come full circle. That's the role for these multi-collaborative kind of undertakings to do that. But it has to start with some respect that just because you got it right here doesn't mean you know how it's going to work in Kenya or Mozambique or where have you. By the way, we would all aspire all around the world to have the kind of ethos for incentives and success that's built here in Silicon Valley. And at the end of the day, if business is really going to be harnessed to do good, don't rely on the good intentions of business. There's got to be, create the conditions where business can do what business does and create opportunities for people. But if we're all counting on every business person to be a really great person, that might limit our aspirations. On education, I would just, the observation, something right is happening, either in families or in education, and certainly in graduate schools it's happening, but this panel has said earlier, it really is the case that this generation comes to work and the workplace with aspirations and hopes about what I can do to make a difference in my community and in the world, unlike, I know, my own generation. I often look back to, being in graduate school down at Stanford when Net Impact was first getting going and going to a national convening of Net Impact. There's something like 400 people there. And I think now Net Impact, dedicated to social change, and our annual convenings are turning people away with 35,000, 40,000 sort of annual people coming annually. And that's just representative of this generation. So something is going on there in terms of what's happening in education or culturally that's made a difference generationally.
Wow, just fabulous. Two quick things, then we really do have to close. First, please be seated at 10:25 sharp to hear the Egyptian foreign minister. Really important that everyone be back here at that time. It's a relatively short break, my apology. That's a segue to saying this was a fabulous conversation. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Join me in thanking everyone.